everyone, and welcome to another installment of Setting History Straight. Linda Watson is our host. She's going to be broadcasting from New Orleans, Louisiana. My name is Joey Thompson. I'll be giving the color commentary, if you will. I'm in North Georgia. This radio program is heard live, dedicated to basically setting history straight within the confines of telling our people who they are, where they've come from, and the purpose of this is to ensure that they can turn back to the covenant of the Most High, Yahweh. Linda, how are you doing today?
Just fine. Thank you very much.
What you got for us?
I'm going to talk tonight about two things. I want to talk that Israel was in the land of Canaan, and I also want to talk about the migration of the Israelites in the 700 BC. I'm going to start by reading Deuteronomy 32:7. It's a real important scripture for history. It says, "Remember the days of old and consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, thy elders, and they will tell you." So we're admonished to study ancient history. So we want to start down the migration path, and we've covered the Trojan kings, we covered the early migrations. Now we're going to cover the migration of the 700 BC, which is right before the Syrians captured Samaria. So what we want to talk about first is who were these people? Who were the Hebrews?
Well, if you're asking who the Hebrews are, anyone from the lineage of Eber, a couple of lines down from Shem, would be considered a Hebrew.
Well, most people today believe that the Jewish people themselves are the only remaining people of the 12 tribes of Israel. And
Right.
That's one of the purposes of our program, is to teach people that that is not true, that the 12 tribes are still alive and well all over the world. And that is the purpose of this program, is to prove that. There's so much history out there right now that you can't hardly go on the internet and type anything without people coming up and having a page explaining the same principle. There's page after page after page after page. And now some of the encyclopedias are jumping on the bandwagon. So we're beginning to see that there's this turn in this country, that people are beginning to know their roots and know their origin. So what we want to talk about first is we want to prove that that the Israelites actually went into the land of Canaan, and there's some significant proofs of that. We're going to start with the Amorian tablets. Now, the Amorian tablets are located in the British Museum. They were a correspondence between the Canaanite rulers and the Egyptians. Now, there's a book out called The Oldest Letters in the World, written in 1923 by Sidney Bistro. And Sidney basically wrote this book, and one of the things she put in there was about the Amorian tablets. And this is her comment. She said, "The greatest importance of the Amorian tablets has not been recognized because of the translators have been unwilling to admit that the Israelites are mentioned upon them. They tell of talking about the tablets, they tell of the conquest of Palestine by Joshua. The names Hebri, and Abri are the names that appear frequently in the tablets. And yet, many language experts certify that it stands for the Hebrews." So what they're saying basically is that even though they know that these names that they see represent the Hebrews, they are still unwilling to say that the Hebrews are mentioned on the Amorian tablets, and that it was the Israelites that went into the land of Canaan. Now, I just think that's unbelievable information. That's our proof that Joshua went into the land of Canaan, and that the Israelites were actually in the land of Canaan. It's an actual stone that they've got from Egypt many years ago. The second proof is called the Besistian rock in Persia. Now, that's real interesting, because that rock was created around the 5th century by Darius, the Persian king Darius, and he listed all his accomplishments. And one of his accomplishments was that he listed all the nations and countries that he ruled over, and he mentioned a people called Sake, and that's S-A-K-A. Now, the interesting part is that particular stone or rock that's on the face of the mountain is named after the mountain itself, and it sits on the border between Iran and Iraq. That particular stone is in 3 languages, and one of the languages is obviously Persian because Darius was a Persian, right? But the other language was the language of the Elam, the people of Elam, and the third language was, I think that was the language from Babylon. So you had 3 languages there. So that's the same inscription in 3 languages. So the interesting part is that we get to see who the people in Babylon were referring to when they talked about the Sake people. So the Sake people that are mentioned in the Persian language are called the Gimris in the Babylonian language. Now, the reason that's important is because the word Gimri appears all through history. And so it's a connection that we have so that we know who these people are. And the other name for them was the Simeons. That's Cimmeris. Joey, I know you've done a little research on the Rosetta Stone. Can you tell everybody a little bit about it?
Sure. Well, basically, Napoleon is credited for finding this puppy, and it was in the summer of 1798 when Britain and France was fighting over trade routes, and they had come to blows in the land of Egypt. And Napoleon had 2 basic, he was looking for 2 things. He was looking, 1, to conquer that region for the purpose of extending trade routes for France and his allies. And 2, he had a backdoor agenda because he wanted to find out all of the ancient secrets of ancient Egypt, to find out their power, because he felt like that there would be an incredible amount of a wealth of knowledge there that he could use in his military skills. And after he had conquered the land the first time, because the first battle went to Napoleon and the French, Israel retreated, and basically instead of establishing the land as he should, he went ahead for his second agenda and started establishing men to tear into some of the ancient ruins of Egypt and try and find what they could. And as a side, this is not what he intended, but as a side, he had soldiers tear down a wall that was in his way, and in the middle of that wall was this Rosetta Stone. And it was found. It's called the Rosetta Stone because it was found in the town or village of Rosetta, which is right on the Mediterranean Sea, right on the coastline. And this thing had 3 languages on it. And the 3 languages were Greek, which the world knew, Demotic, not demonic, but Demotic, D-E-M-O-T-I-C, and Hieroglyphic, which was the language that was in question and was not known. And basically this stone told the story of Ptolemy V, and it was commemorating his 1-year anniversary. So it really was nothing historical that was on the stone. It was everything to do with the fact that they had a scale, if you will, to translate hieroglyphics from Greek, the known language. So that's basically it in a nutshell, and it was a great find. I'm sure Yahweh had his hands in it, and because he wanted this information to be revealed, all of the great historical evidences about Israel and other people in Egyptian history. And once they got the key, they could go back to everything that was written on the stones in Egypt, and they could translate them and find a tremendous amount of wealth of information about the histories of that land.
Well, it's interesting that the thing that they did not know until the 1800s was what the actual language was that the Egyptians, they saw the language of the Egyptians, but they had no way, the experts had no way to interpret it. So what the Rosetta Stone did for them is gave them a way to, if they knew what the words were in Greek, then they could translate and learn what the words were in the hieroglyphic language, which was the Egyptian language. And it was so critical because the Egyptians wrote so much about the Israelites. And so that was why it was so very significant. And yes, I think God did have his hand in that. He was probably all over that. And so was he the same way with the other stones? Because there's an interesting scripture. It says, if you don't teach my people and tell my people, what does Yahweh say he will do? He said, I'll raise up stones to teach my people. And so that's actually what has happened. And you see there's a lot of stones that are out there that bear the history of Israel and bear the history of our people. Now, I mentioned so much about Israel, but, I want people to understand the connection that they have with the Israelites, because if they ever make that connection in this country, they would turn back to keeping the Torah. And they would know that their fathers kept it and their fathers have kept it. And it's not to say that other people who are not Israelites, can't also have knowledge of Torah and the Bible. That's not what we're driving for here. We're driving for the idea that once people know their heritage and their origin and their roots, that would help them, cause them to go back to the Torah. So right now we want to talk about the captivity of Israel. And we know that there was a migration that occurred around 700 BC. Now, the father of history's name was Herodias. And Herodias wrote about how there was a group of people that lived around the Black Sea. They lived around in the Caspian Mountain area, and he called them the Simeons. That we talked about those earlier. We touched on those earlier. That's Cimmerians. All right, and those particular people, the historians tell us they have no record of how they got there. But we're going to talk tonight and give you a strong possibility of how they got into that area. Now, we're going to talk first, and the tribes of Israel. We had 12 tribes, and they had already settled in the land. And of course, they did not obey God, so God was going to remove them from the land. He had already told them that if they continued in their sinful ways, that they would be removed from the land. Now, the interesting thing is that when we're going to look at these scriptures for the captivity, but only 4 of the tribes actually went into captivity. I'm going to prove that to you tonight. Now remember that you had 3 tribes that were basically in the land of Judah, and that was Benjamin, and that was Judah itself, and most of the Levites was in that land also. So those 3 tribes were not impacted by the Assyrian campaigns that came down, but they were impacted later, obviously, but we're not going to be discussing those tonight. The tribes that went into captivity was Naphtali, Gad, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Reuben. I guess that's actually 5 tribes that went into captivity, and we're going to show you that. The other tribes are never mentioned. Now, remember, I just talked to you about how Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh got their land. They went to Moses and said, we want this land on the east side of the Jordan River. And Canaan was on the west side of the Jordan. You had Gad and you had Manasseh, only half of Manasseh, because the other half of Manasseh was on the other side. And you had the tribe of Reuben. So you had those 3 tribes on the east side. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the first Assyrian campaign. The first Assyrian campaign, it says the Assyrians carried captive perhaps up to a third of Israel in the reign of King Pekah. Now, Joey, would you like to read 2 Kings 15:29 for me?
Okie doke. It was while Pekah was king that Tiglath-Pileser, I've practiced that all day, it didn't work very well, the emperor of Assyria, captured the cities of Ijon, Abel, Beth-Makath, Joath, Kedash, and Hazar, and the territories of Gilead, Galilee, and Naphtali, and took the people to Assyria as prisoners.
Okay, now, when I looked up every one of these names of the cities, and all of them were located in the land of Naphtali except Abel-Beth-Maachah, and that was located in Manasseh. But the others that are mentioned here, the cities that are mentioned here were all cities in Naphtali. So I think that's really interesting because we assume that all the Israelites went into captivity during these 3 campaigns of Assyria. And the fact is, the cities are basically from these 5 tribes that we mentioned earlier. That's all. Gilead is actually in the land of Gad. That impacted. Gad was taken. Some of their people were taken. Galilee is around the area of Manasseh. So you see that the areas that are being impacted are basically those same tribes that we talked about. Reuben wasn't impacted in this particular campaign. Now, the Israelites, when they saw what was happening, and they saw that the Assyrians had came into the land, they began to migrate out. And what happened was you had 5 tribes that migrated out. Well, Asher was one that migrated out. Dan, remember Dan? There was 2 parts to Dan. Dan had 2 pieces of property in the land of Israel. Well, Dan's property at the northern part of Israel, they were still in that land, but they were scattered from Greece, probably into Carthage and into Ireland. So, but there were still some people from the tribe of Dan there. Zebulun, Simeon, and Issachar. Those tribes, at that point, when the Assyrians attacked Israel, they packed up and left. As there is no mention of those tribes going into captivity.
Linda, let me jump in here. You said Dan, who is the judges, and Naphtali. No, Naphtali was taken into captivity, correct?
Right.
Yeah. What about Gad?
Gad was taken. See, that was Gad's property. Is their tribe had the land of Gilead.
Right.
So Gilead is mentioned there. Reuben is not in this first Exodus.
Okay.
Reuben is not in this first Exodus. If he is, it's not mentioned, you see. They didn't mention him being in there. But he will go into captivity with the other tribes. But that first Exodus is what caused everybody to begin to migrate out of the land. So we start hearing all these stories in history about how there was this large migration of people that came into Europe called the Celtic people and the Semian people that went into Europe, and they said, we don't really know where they came from. They absolutely do know where they came. They are not willing to put it in the histories. It parallels perfectly with that time frame where Israel was beginning to fall. It parallels perfectly. So it's amazing to me that they leave out the Israelites. It's either they do it deliberately or they truly don't consider them being a very large country, and I've thought about that. But during the time of King David, there was over 20 million people. So it's just amazing. So the second campaign of the Assyrians, it says the Syrians carried captive at the time of the region of Gilead, which consisted of the Israelite tribes, Gad, Reuben, and half of Manasseh. Okay, so Joey, would you read for me 1 Chronicles 5:26?
Sure thing. And the Elohim of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, and the spirit of Tilgath-Pilsner, king of Assyria. And we've got 2 kings of Assyria there. That's interesting.
Can I just make a comment here?
Sure.
Pul is the same king. The Tiglath-Pileser is the same king as Pul.
Okay. That's interesting. And he carried them away, and even the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half tribe of Manasseh, and brought them to Halai, Harbor, and Hera, and the river Gozan unto this very day.
All right, now there's a river that's in the land of Iraq. All 3 of these cities are really in modern day Iraq. They're on the western side of the Tigris River, and that river that was called the Gozaz River actually was a tributary. It filtered down into the Euphrates River. But today they don't call it by that name, and I searched to try and find out what they called it today, and it apparently there's no connection that I can find, but I'm sure it's still there. But I think that's really interesting because that was the ancient land of Assyria, and it's actually in history called the land of the Medes.
says the Elohim of Israel, that's Yahweh. He's the one that did this. He stirred up the spirit. And of course, you and I are in agreement that the punishments that come upon Israel, they're not just time and chance and circumstance. Yahweh himself brings these punishments upon us because of our sins. And certainly he did the same thing to Israel at that time.
It certainly did. And it talks about in First Kings why he brought this punishment on the people. And it was because they were doing unbelievable stuff. They were actually sacrificing their children. They were sacrificing their children on the altar for Baal.
A lot of the sins, the shortcomings, we'll say, of Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26 can be found in those accounts. Yeah, he meant what he said when he talked about, the blessings and cursings of Israel in those chapters, and he brought them to fruition in that account, and I think that's a type of what's coming.
I know it's a type of what's coming. You're absolutely right. Now, in 2 Kings 17:7, I'm just going to read. It says, they followed idols, became idolaters, went after the nations that were all around them. They left all the commandments of Yahweh and made for themselves a molten image and 2 calves, made a wooden image and worshipped all the host of the heavens and served Baal. And they caused their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire. There you go. It's a sacrifice. They sacrificed their children. And they practiced witchcraft, and they practiced soothsaying. Now, I want to mention soothsaying to you. It's a very interesting study if you ever want to look into that. Soothsaying was drug abuse. And that just proves there's nothing new under the sun, is there? I mean, they were involved with drug abuse during the time right before their captivity. And they sold themselves to do evil in the sight of Yahweh to provoke him to anger. Therefore, Yahweh was very angry with Israel and removed them from his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah alone. So, I mean, that really tells the story right there, what you were saying, Joey. It's that, if in this country needs to know that history always repeats itself. That what's happening to this nation is that happened to Israel in ancient Israel is going to happen again. History repeats itself. And you can read Ecclesiastes 3:15, and it tells you that God requires the things of the past to be in the present. So he's telling you that the history repeats itself. It just boggles me to see what's going to happen to the nation. I see so many pastors teaching prophecy and all the different signs, and everybody's guessing as to who is the beast. And wouldn't you just put your concentration in a different area? And wouldn't you just say, well, isn't it more important to prevent these things from happening? Because if we turn back to Yahweh, and these things wouldn't be coming upon our land.
Yeah, and the two big things, Linda, is idolatry and Sabbath keeping. Or Sabbath breaking. As a matter of fact, that's what Leviticus 26 opens up with. Those are the two things that Yahweh's really, really paying attention to.
And they also punished them because they refused to keep the land rest. Yep. And that was that added many years to their captivity, because he took the years that they didn't let the land rest, and he said, well, these are the years that you're going to be removed.
That was 1 year for every Sabbath, land Sabbath that they missed. So if it was 84 years they went without breaking the land Sabbath. We're
going to go ahead and go into that final phase of the captivity. And we'll start by reading 2 Kings 17:5.
It says, then the king of Assyria came upon throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. And in the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them in Halah and in Harbor by the river Gozan and in the cities of the Medes, which is southwestern Iran.
Now, we just had read 2 Kings 17:5. I'm going to ask you exactly now. The interesting thing about it is that it took 3 years for Samaria to fall. Now, Samaria is located in the land of Canaan, and it was land in the tribe of Ephraim is where you could find Samaria. And the interesting thing is that, again, history records that only 29,000 people were taken captive. And the Syrians recorded that in their history. They said only 29,000 people were taken captive from Samaria. So the question is, where in the world did the rest of them go? They had already left the land. Go ahead.
Some of them actually stayed in the land, because we know that from the account of John 4 with a woman at the well. She was an Israelite, and of course some of them fled, just as you said. They saw what was coming and they got out of Dodge.
Exactly. But our historians are not willing to entertain the possibility that the Israelites could have been the people that went into Europe at that same huge migration period. When you had this huge migration, if you look up the Celtic people, it tells you that the Celtic people basically were in Europe around the 700. They began to migrate in around the 7th century. Well, what does that tell you? That's the same identical time that Assyria is fallen.
And they would have gotten there. They would have gotten there on the ships of Dan. I mean, you're talking about a quick period of time to be established in another land all the way across the Mediterranean. A lot of people will question how they got there so quick, and that would be one of the ways.
Now, there was 2 prophets during that time, and people need to also identify what the books are that was written at the time that the captivity came down, and that was the book of Hosea and the book of Amos. Those 2 books were written for the tribes of Israel for that captivity, but they also have inserts about future events. And so it also applies for the future, but it's really interesting because Amos was probably the most interesting to me, because all the prophets, every one of them were Levites. They could trace their origin back to a Levitical priesthood, but Amos was not. Amos specifically said, I am not of the priest. I'm not a priest. My family wasn't priest. Yahweh just went out and said, I want you to come out of your field and go and tell the king what I want him to know. And that's exactly, I think that's an amazing story.
He was a sheep breeder.
No, and he also raised sycamores. It's not the same sycamore. I think it's kind of like a fig tree. But he was a farmer. So he said, come out of the field. And Amos said, well, what about my field over here? He's going to take care of that. He said, you just go tell the king what I want him to know. And so, Yahweh will use whoever he chooses to use. That's just a fact. And the interesting thing about it is we know that these people moved out of the land before then, because you only had 29,000 people from Samaria that went into captivity. What does that tell you? And you're right, some of them did stay behind. But remember that David had as much as 20 million people under his reign. So where did all these people go? They migrated out. That's where they went. Now, we're going to get into more history later in the other programs and prove more information to you. But one of those tribes we talked about was Simeon. Now, Jan Davies, in his book, wrote that Simeon went to the land of Wales. Now, Wales has a tremendous history from the language standpoint, because the Welsh language, when you look at the root words for the Welsh language, 80% of them have Hebrew root words. And that's unbelievable. Now, the old Saxon English language also was 80% root words were Hebrew. And Tyndale made a comment that he said the English language has 1,000 more times Hebrew words in it for their root words as Latin. So everyone thought, well, our language comes from Latin. No, our language basically has those Hebrew root words in it, because that's where we came from. That's our origin.
Linda, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but another language that is prevalent in the lands of Israel, and of course I'm speaking specifically of the western lands of Israel, United States, Great Britain, Ireland, so on, is Gaelic. Gaelic is the language in Iceland and some of the other Scandinavian nations, and Gaelic is it's identical to Hebrew.
Wow. No, I never knew that. Now, Canon Lyson, who was a linguistic expert, noted that there was 5,000 Hebrew words in the English language, and the people there was 3 men that studied the language for Wales, and Charles Edwards wrote a book in 1675. Sir Charles Morrison, and Steve Langston. All three of those were language experts, and they verified that the language for Wales was 80% Hebrew. And I think that's amazing. Now, that should prove to you that if their language was Hebrew, their origin was Hebrew. I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot to prove that. Now, the historical record that we have, and we're going to read the historical record from the book of Ezra. And it's Ezra, and it's going to be Ezra 13, verses 39-45. And 2nd Ezra 13 that was one of the books of the Apocrypha. Now, I'm going to read this to you. It says, "Those are the tribes which were carried away captive out of their own land in the time of Hosea the king, when Salmanasar the king of Assyria took captive and crossed them across the river, so that they were brought into another land. But they took counsel themselves that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go farther into the future land which never man dwelt, that there might keep their statutes, and they might keep them in their own land. And they entered in at a narrow pass at the river Euphrates. For the Most High then showed them signs and stayed the spring and floods till they passed away. And through the country there was a great journey, even for a year and a half. And the same region was called Osiris. Now, Osiris is the land around the Black Sea, and that was where the Israelites actually, when they were in captivity, they left their captivity when Assyria became weakened, and they left out and went in around the Black Sea area, in the Caucasus Mountains area, and Armenia was where they mainly had settled. Now, this is the only major historical record that we have that tells us about this migration that they actually did out of the land of Assyria into Armenia. And what has happened in the 1870s is this book was taken out of the Bible. And if they left it in, people would have known their heritage. And it was taken out by the British Foreign Bible Society. And if you look into their background, some of them don't even believe in the Messiah, and some of them don't believe in the Torah. So what are you doing with people that are making decisions about Bible information and what should be in there when they don't follow the scriptures, they are not Torah keepers, and they don't believe in the Messiah? So why would they be sitting on that committee? It's the most amazing thing.
That's one of those punishments that Yahweh slipped in. I mean, I still see Yahweh's hand in all that, because, you know, he sets up kings and tears down kings. He puts in power on committees whom he wants on those committees to suit his purpose. And I think one of the greatest afflictions or punishments on this people, on our people, is, you know, we've been blinded to who we are. And that really is due to sin. At the end of the day, it's our own sins that cause that.
Absolutely. It's absolutely true. And the Scythians, these were the people that we're talking about now. They moved into Eastern Europe, and they were called the Scythians. And just like we mentioned our proofs before, you have the stones. You have the Byzantine stone, you have the Armenian tablets. All of them point back to the fact that the Israelites were a living, breathing, real people, and it's not a made-up fairy tales. The Bible's not made up. It can be backed up with history. That's the whole point of what we're covering. Go through what our ancestors did. So thank you very much, and we'll hear from you later.
Blessings to everyone.